when you look at what the conversation is about CRT on social media, it really takes a whole nother level. It's like disinformation personified. What have you been seeing around this issue?
Yeah, first of all, I want to concur with what you just said about the way in which they're using Martin Luther King's words. Actually, Bernice King herself had several tweets about the way in which her dad's, words are being misconstrued to talk about racism as if it was in the opposite frame. What they're talking about with critical race theory is to basically say that they don't want to have a conversation about race at all in this country and this impact on individuals who happen to be of different hues. And they're using his words in the complete opposite way. I totally agree with you with that. And I'll say also one of the things that we've tracked in terms of some of these policies that some of these schools are trying to institute, including Tennessee, they don't want to tell Ruby Bridges' story. Ruby was the young girl who had to go against a mob to go to school every day. And so as they're saying that they don't want young children to face this when they go to school from K to 12, they're not talking about Ruby at all. They're not talking about any children that look like Ruby. They're saying that Ruby and the likes of children like her, she was 6 years old, should endure racism while children who are maybe participating in racism are not being held accountable at all at the exact same age, nor their parents. We've seen in terms of these parents who've shown up as mobs at school boards trying to downplay critical race theory in the school systems, when what they're actually saying, it's not critical race theory. What they're saying is they don't want history taught. In Texas, for example, they are basically trying to remove the notion that the KKK was immoral. They're trying to remove Martin Luther King from the school curriculum. They're trying to remove a whole bunch of host of issues of what the history really was in America. And to be clear, that had nothing to do with critical race theory. The way that they're using it is different. And so what we did today is put out our report about how this is transitioned to actual legal action, school boards, legislation, which is what Cotton has done. It's all based on disinformation. It's all based on disinformation that has been led predominantly by conservative media and spread through Facebook and Twitter. And so what we've done is we've looked at this historically, looked at a whole year on Twitter. We went through around 40,000 pieces of content on Facebook. We've taken 10% of that content and tried to show a story about how this has happened, why it has happened, but most importantly, what content is being distributed and how often. There's always this conversation, and there's been plenty of hearings on the Hill, that there's conservative bias on these platforms, and that the tech companies are more liberal, and they're instituting these biases. But what our data says is that that's not correct. Actually, the majority of the content being shared overwhelmingly is conservative content. It's the anti-CRT, it's the disinformation, and it's the it's targeting anti-racist in any kind of anti-racist frames, any kind of diversity frames, any kind of discussion about race in this country.
So how do you stop that from happening? I mean, Facebook and Twitter and these social media platforms, they have a problem that you and I already know with stopping everything from what we saw from the 2020 election to, even keeping our personal information, safe. So how do you uproot that level of disinformation about such an important situation, such an important issue like critical race theory?
I think that we have to admit the fact that what has been happening is that the algorithms has been benefiting and amplifying the disinformation, and has been amplifying the conspiracy theorists, has been amplifying predominantly white voices. I mean, that's what our data shows. Because when you look at the data that actually that comes from liberal media or media or any content that's being shared by the Black community or Black scholars, very little content is distributed or shared. Like basically from a Black content perspective, it's 2.8%. When it comes to how it gets shared, it's 0.9% in comparison to the conservative shares of this content. So that's why we took a look at this. We're trying to say it's more than just an accident that this is happening. It's that the systems of which these companies have built on in terms of their algorithms and their amplifications is allowing this to happen. And one of the ways that we can maybe counter this is to go back to saying, well, how are we elevating or maybe suppressing the voices that are trying to say a counter narrative to the disinformation. And from what we're seeing is that there's some steps that can be taken, but first these companies have to acknowledge that their algorithms are amplifying and weaponizing the disinformation for clicks and impressions and user base.
So from the average user like you and me, should we be advocating to not have these conversations on social media?
No, I don't think we should stop having the conversation. I just think that we need to be, we need to be talking about it more to counter the disinformation. We need to report. We need to also report more of that disinformation. But we also need to make sure that we are participating and sharing more of that content. But I will also say this, the media, i.e. the media who's supposed to help us counter that information, needs to be doing more as well. Because the content that's going out from even quote unquote left-leaning media, if you look at our report, we go through all the different media through a bias lens, a third-party bias lens that tells us which media is leaning which direction, whether it's left or right or center. We're noticing that the content that's being shared the most is mostly right-leaning. And if the media decides to talk about it, they're just amplifying the disinformation, giving profiles to people who are already spreading the disinformation, instead of giving profiles to people who are counting the critical race theory frames, telling the truth about what critical race theory is, telling the truth of what history is in the school systems. Those people are not being amplified. The media, by the way, isn't talking about it. We're doing this right now on Black media, but we need this on mainstream media as well, to have more of our voices to help amplify, to also be shared and distributed on these platforms as well.
I want to bring back our panel to pose questions to you, Shireen. Reese, I know that you have been a strong advocate about disinformation across many different conversations. What's your question for Shireen Mitchell?
Hey, Shireen. So good to see you again. Yes, I mentioned earlier I have an op-ed today in the Griot about disinformation. So it is something that I feel like we are not talking about enough in our community. Can you kind of explain some strategies, like, for instance, instead of retweeting, maybe screenshotting, and, also explain how we interact with some of this inflammatory data, like, the algorithms reward these people because they use what you interact with as a basis to show you even more of it. So even if you are disagreeing with it, it's not necessarily taken into account whether you approve or not. It's still going to push more of that data into your feed. So can you kind of just give the viewers a little bit more insight into how those algorithms reward this inflammatory and disinformation activity?
Yeah, definitely. So the more, the more quote tweets, the more retweets on a particular piece of content that is disinformation, and you're trying to debunk it, it's just going to help that be amplified. What you want to do is not quote tweet or retweet, but to have a different tweet that you are basically criticizing that particular tweet. If you're doing a screenshot, that's fine. But maybe what you do is tell a whole different narrative and do a whole thread on what critical race theory really is, and what's happening in your community that is being done about it. Like, to counter the narrative is to help get that content amplified from other people, from other experts that may talk about it, but not to amplify the disinformation content at all in any form. The way in which these things are gamed, with the fake accounts, and I think you know about this, pretending to be us and all these other aspects that may share that content, when that happens and other people continue to share or even respond to the fake accounts, it just allows the amplification. And what we want to do is make sure we're amplifying the real people. We want to make sure we want to amplify the real experts. We want to amplify the content and the articles and the media pieces that are about what CRT really is, to counter the narrative that's out there. Right now, disinformation is spread 6 more times than factual, and we need to change that number around.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Dr. Carr, what's your question for Shireen Mitchell?
Shireen, this is a difficult one for me because, I agree with Tom Cotton. I embrace him. I don't think he's wrong. If you accept his definition of America, which leads me to the question, how much of this is our inability to address fundamental issues of national identity and political power? I mean, when you really stop to think, and having read the 1776 report and really done a deep dive and looked through, thematically, in my mind, there's no difference between the 1776 report and the 1619 project in terms of still placing American exceptionalism and this idea of this country, this perfectible experiment, at the core of our aspiration. Now, how much of this is our inability or unwillingness to grapple with the fact that the heart of critical race theory opposes everything these white nationalists stand for, and that they are fighting for their lives? Instead of trying to make appeals about logic and facts, this ain't about logic and facts. These white people are circling the wagons. How much of this is about our inability to have an honest conversation about this?
Well, there's a lot to that. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, not only the honest conversation is it's like the fact that they don't want Ruby's book in schools. That means that they don't want to talk about what happened to Ruby. They don't want to talk about the mobs, right? We're having a conversation about the fact that we want to pretend. I've said this multiple times. As I hear people say, well, I didn't enslave your ancestors, right? That conversation comes up all the time, but your people did. And the truth is, right at this moment, you're still denying the racism that you participate in right now. That's what cancel culture is about. That's what wokeness, anti-wokeness is about. In my opinion, anti-wokeness in the frameworks of it is saying anti-black anyway, because it's a black term. So we're basically saying that people in this moment don't want to be held accountable. So we know they don't want to be held accountable for the past of their own ancestors. And so because of that, we are systematically, and we have systematically been coming up with muzzle laws to make sure that we aren't telling those stories. And so we've already had the problem with even telling the true stories in our current history books. And now what they want to do is remove them entirely. Like when you see, states that are literally trying to take MLK out of the books, that just tells you they don't want to tell the history at all. And so what you are saying is that this country does not want to grapple at all with its history. No matter how many times someone says that, real history needs to be told, as if it's not being told now in proper ways. But they're also saying that we want real history. We don't want theories. But what they're doing is they're using the theory, the concept of critical race theory, which is looking at laws, the actual laws in this country that are racist laws, like sundown towns. Like they want to use laws right now to remove history. But if you think about it, critical race theory would be criticizing the fact that they wanted to remove that history. Exactly. And using the law to do it. Exactly. So we're in a cycle here that is very much about what you just said. I mean, Tom Cotton is really saying out loud, we should never have to rehash any of our history. We should not remember Tulsa. We should not remember slavery. We should not remember that even at this moment, some cities still have sundown towns. Right? That's right. That's what they're asking for at this point. And what we've been doing is saying we need to not one, talk about it, but two, get rid of those laws.
That's right.
Amisha?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say thanks for coming on and giving us as much information as you have thus far. As someone who's worked in the K-12 system and has designed policy for both K-12 as well as early childhood education, we tell facts on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Critical race theory is not taught in ECE, and it's not taught in K-12, and it's not taught at the university level either. This is a law school theory. And if you haven't been to law school and chosen it as an elective, you're not hearing anything about critical race theory anyway. What we're seeing is a major pushback from largely conservatives who are upset about the Black Lives Matter protests, who are upset about the reaction of the globe after they saw the tragedy of George Floyd's murder. What we're seeing is this push from a lot of right-leaning individuals to eradicate Black history, which is American history, from our history books. Be mindful, only a short portion of it was actually ever included to begin with, but they want to get rid of that as well. My question is around what is it that makes them believe that young people don't already know that America's racist? As a kid, I remember in first grade, one of my close friends who I rode the school bus with held her arm out after inviting me to a birthday party and said that her mom told her that only people who had the same color arm as her could come to her party. When we have people who say this and understand it in the first grade, you cannot tell me that these kids are totally in some mythical world where they don't see the differences between black and white. Learning how we got there and why this persists is part of understanding who we are as America. Why is it that the right consistently acts as though teaching these things about our history and how we got here is somehow going to make you unpatriotic or is going to destroy this ideal of American greatness?
It's around the guilt that they have about what they have done to people like us in this country and what they're telling their children. Because that child didn't put her arm out there to do that if her mother didn't tell her that's who could come to her party. And it's also the same argument that we're having. They're saying we don't want these 5 or 6 year olds to know anything about race, so we don't want to have that be a discussion. While those same parents are having that discussion at home with their children, they just don't want their children to get punished if they come to school repeating those words. Right? On the school bus that you're talking about. Like, that's what they don't want. And they don't want to have curriculums in place that would make it possible for there to have children who can have some kind of recourse if it was to happen to them. Like what happened in Texas, as an example, was the video of the kids, basically showing themselves saying the N-word. Those kids were being held to account, and that school, the parents came and took over that school board. That's what they're actually talking about. They're just using CRT as the umbrella of the justification to do so. We're not having the conversations that really need to be had. But what they are saying is that black and brown children should experience racism as it's always been, and that their children should not be held accountable for any of their actions, and neither should they as parents teaching their kids that either. That's the truth.
Well, Shireen, it's going to be interesting to see how this continues to play out, especially now that the Senate has said that they're not going to provide a federal funding. So it's, when we're seeing all of this different disinformation on social media, going back to something that you said, which I think is very important, is we have to use our voice, amplify our voice against the conservative view of history of America. And I'm a true advocate of this, Shireen. If this country wants to get better, it has to hold up the mirror to look at itself, to be the good, the bad, the ugly, take it all in. Otherwise, this denial, and going back to Dr. Carr's point, to always be in the space of American exceptionalism, that is going to be the Achilles heel of this country. This country is already on shaky ground. But that is going to be the Achilles heel, that if we don't see it past the quote unquote exceptionalism and say, oh no, we're great, and just be in a constant state of denial, we're going to do ourselves more harm than good. So I appreciate you coming on tonight, Shireen.
What I will say is, just really quickly, the lie of American exceptionalism is the biggest American disinformation campaign we've ever had.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. That's right. And they're never gonna give it up. They give it up. They can't live without it. Oh, they're gonna think about it. They'll never quit. Just ain't they stick. But anyway, enough Barry White.
Shireen Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us tonight here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me again.
Folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Ceek.com, we're partnering with them, of course. We appreciate their support right here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Check out a couple of their products that you can take advantage of.
And you're watching us on Ceek.
What's going on? This Quavo Huncho, but right now you in the Huncho's world.
Please let the music play.
Enjoy the Ceek.com video by using one of their virtual reality headsets. All you do is just pop your phone right here into the VR headset and enjoy the content. You can also take advantage of their 360-degree headphones. These headphones here come in a couple of colors, black and gold, but then also all gold. And so you can check these out. If you want to use our promo code to get a discount, it's RMVIP21, RMVIP21. Then, of course, a portion of the proceeds comes back to Roland Martin Unfiltered, which allows for us to fund the show. And so this is a black-owned company, and we certainly believe in supporting black-owned companies. Barry Spiel is the founder. And so, again, go to Ceek.com and use the promo code RMVIP21.